China, I think, is trying to manufacture this crisis as a way to weaken the support of a hawkish prime minister. This is China trying to throw its economic weight around to pressure other countries into complying. Japan definitely has some ways of sort of pushing back against China.
A seemingly offhand remark from Japan's new prime minister has sparked a diplomatic and perhaps economic crisis with neighboring China. So what's behind the disagreement and where's it going? Well, William Chou is an analyst at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on China and Japan. He joins us now from Brussels. William, welcome. Tell us to what extent, help us sort of put this in perspective. Is this kind of spat something we've seen before, first of all? And I guess, where could it be heading? I want to get in just a moment into sort of the background behind it or what exactly caused it. But what's your sort of upfront assessment?
Sure, Stephen, it's great to be here. Essentially, what happened was that in a diet session, Prime Minister Takaichi said that if China were to use force against Taiwan, that would pose a threat to Japan's survival and prompt the use of collective self-defense, which is what they introduced back in 2015 as a way to allow Japan to work more effectively with the United States in the event of a security contingency in the region. And so that prompted China to respond very aggressively, including the consul general in Osaka, to basically make a fairly personal attack on the prime minister. But I think there's been a lot of reactions back and forth. But I think you have to look at the real purpose, which is looking at the timing and also the reasons for the spat. It's about weakening Takaichi diplomatically and domestically. She had a great visit with Trump, strong ties with Taiwan, and is domestically very popular in Japan. And so China, I think, is trying to manufacture this crisis as a way to weaken the support of a hawkish prime minister, especially with the Japanese industry, whom she would need to work closely with to implement her economic growth and economic security agenda.
I want to get into Beijing's leverage when it comes to trade with Japan in just a moment. But first of all, do you think Takaichi was signaling a new approach to Taiwan, or was this really a kind of off-the-cuff remark? How do you view it?
This is not a new development. This is not a new security position for Japan. Japan has had this position since 2015, where essentially if there's a security contingency where a close ally may be attacked or involved in a crisis that would offer a national security sort of a threat to Japan that threatens Japan's survival, then Japan has the ability to use military force to work closely with that ally. Obviously, the most likely contingency would have been if there were a Chinese attack on Taiwan and the U.S. were to be involved. American bases in Japan would likely be attacked, and that would constitute a reason for Japan to be involved in this in that kind of conflict. This is not a new development. We've known this since 2015. China is basically trying to make an opportunity out of this out of her statement.
How serious can this get? This seems like it's more than just a shot across the bow if we're talking about a rupture in trade relations, calling off diplomatic meetings, trilateral meetings coming up with, I believe, amongst culture ministers of South Korea and Japan and China. So we're seeing step by step this is getting a bit worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it definitely China's definitely taking a lot of measures to be very aggressive in its approach to it. Right, they're trying to undermine Prime Minister Takaichi. They've done things like essentially, ask Chinese tourists not to go to Japan. I think 25% of Japan's tourism comes from China and Hong Kong. They've shut down Japanese imports from Japan of Japanese seafood. They're canceling all sorts of meetings. They're canceling Japanese pop culture shows. There's obviously other areas where they might try to exert leverage, such as, say, shutting off rare earths exports, which is what they also did back in 2010 over a disagreement over the Senkaku Islands, which are disputed islands between Japan and China. And so this is part of a larger pattern that they've exercised before. They've done it to Japan, they've done it to South Korea, they've done it to Australia. This is China trying to throw its economic weight around to pressure other countries into complying with what they believe is the right diplomatic position, which is obviously very, very aggressive.
Yeah, I do think of that dispute with Australia, in which I believe is about the origins of COVID. I think someone in Australia had said something, maybe even the Prime Minister. And then wine shipments basically from Australia to China basically stopped overnight. That is damaging to certain economic sectors. That's obviously the goal here. I'm looking at a Reuters story that says China's travel boycott alone could cost Japan more than $14 billion in losses each year. That's not something to really just sort of overlook here. I mean, what kind of pressure is Takaichi likely to face over this, or could it even strengthen her? Let's start with the economic damage first. How serious should we take this?
Well, it'll certainly be a significant economic damage, right? As you mentioned with that report in terms of what that means for lost Japanese revenue over tourism, that's $14 billion. That's a significant number. Certainly, the Japanese fishing industry is also a key component of Japan's economy, and also those guys vote. And so, again, that is shutting down Japanese seafood imports from by China is also a way to pressure Takaichi. I think the head of the Keidanren, which is the business federation in Japan, has already expressed an assessment that this spat will likely hurt Japanese businesses, both those who export to China or currently produce and manufacture in China. This is all expected, right? I think this is part of their attempt to turn the economic screws on Japan to pressure her a great deal, because she does need to work closely with industry to implement her economic security and her economic growth plans. At the same time, though, she can't back down. One, she is a hawkish prime minister. She is very close to Taiwan and the Taiwanese leader. Two, the backing down would essentially really hurt her prime ministership, which is extremely popular among the voting public. And so backing down would certainly hurt her politically. And it's important to note that the the government about 13 years ago under the opposition party, when that when that prime minister was seen as essentially kowtowing to China, that effectively submarined his government. And so it also carries domestic implications where I don't think Takaichi would be likely to be backing down anytime soon.
She may not back down, but more than likely she'll have to compromise, as others who have been in a spat with Beijing have done, including Australia. Is there a script for how these things usually go?
Yeah, I think there is going to be a lot of noise on the sort of the public level. I do not expect Takaichi to back down. At the same time, though, you're hearing reports about how, for instance, the vice minister for Asian affairs at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister Sanae, met with his Chinese counterpart to discuss these matters. Certainly, the chief cabinet secretary, Kihara, who is also a close ally of Takaichi's, has been talking to China and essentially saying that we need to continue our dialogue in other areas as well, even as we're working through this issue. And so I think the expectation is that they will continue to talk in the background. Certainly, Takaichi cannot be seen as backing down. But I think as this issue sort of slowly dies down, and look, it's possible that China will continue to ramp up the pressure, right? They may expand to rare earth export limits against Japan, so ramp up the pressure against Japan. But as this slowly winds down, I think a lot of it will have to be done behind the scenes. Certainly, I think both countries are very invested in their public appearances over this matter.
We often talk about these kind of disputes being a kind of one-way street. That is, China's a massive market that other countries, other economies need to really thrive. Is it that simple? Is there any kind of economic leverage that Japan has over China? Are there any screws they can turn?
Yeah. So Japan definitely has some ways of sort of pushing back against China. I think the most important thing is that China tried doing this back in 2010 over the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, and at that time they shut off rare earth mineral exports to Japan. And Japan responded by essentially trying to develop its own sources of rare earths, in terms of working with the Australians to develop their own sources, refining sources, and cutting down their dependency on Chinese rare earth, which China dominates the world in, from 100% down to 60%. That's a really significant improvement just in 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. And so I think what China's playbook is to use its control over key strategic economic sectors, as well as the large size of its market, to pressure other countries into complying with its preferred diplomatic script. I think what Japan has done is Japan has been the first one to really experience that approach. And Japan has also offered a playbook of how to resist against this kind of Chinese pressure, which is essentially to ensure that China doesn't have this kind of leverage over you by developing new sources of these key critical materials like rare earths. And I think, other countries, be it Australia, South Korea, even the United States, have taken note and are also working on their own efforts to lessen China's ability to coerce geopolitically, diplomatically, using economic tools over these sorts of issues.
That is still, however, difficult when we look at the market alone that China represents. Japan, obviously, Taiwan is the same. There's been talk about trying to diversify as much as possible, but that is limited to some extent. Can these nations move away from China as their most important market? Is that happening already as the economy there struggles? Is there more pressure now to do that? How realistic is that?
I think the Chinese market will always be important to the Japanese businesses, right? China is still Japan's largest, market. That said, I think the weaknesses of the Chinese economy, as well as the lack of transparency in China, the use of essentially hostage taking of Japanese business executives using China's espionage law, are warning signs to Japanese businesses and, frankly, other businesses around the world, right, in the U.S., South Korea, Australia, that maybe doing business in China or putting so much reliance on business with China is not the smartest approach. I think over time, other countries will try to find ways to be less reliant on China, both in terms of as a market, as well as as a resource for strategic materials or for key components of their supply chain. I think there is this realization that we need to lessen our dependency on China, because as we've seen just in this year alone, when China used rare earth export restrictions on the United States and globally twice in 1 year, essentially, China is willing to use these tools as blackmail, and this will not stop until we are able to find ways to lessen their leverage. And so I think most countries are being very realistic in their approach and understanding that they have to develop alternative sources and be less reliant on China.
All right. That is William Chou at the Hudson Institute. William, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.